Yeah, good morning. This is Dan Casey, and on behalf of Lynn and Buck Gilcrease and myself, we really appreciate you being here and appreciate this opportunity to present. You've got a good group here before you. Terry Fauché, Alicia Thomas, Monica Zadruski, and I keep screwing up her name, but in any event, but we've got before you a lot of assessment issues, uh, learning outcomes, accountability, updates, and the rest. There's a lot of good material here. And with that, I will turn over to, I think, Monica. Thanks.
No, actually, Dan,
Actually, Alicia, I think.
it's Alicia. And
yes, Alicia, thanks.
So glad to be with you this morning. Terry and Monica and I are for leadership in a different time, leadership during the time of COVID-19. We're looking right now at a genuine American hero, right? General Stanley McChrystal, he was the JSOC commander, and he says leader behaviors are critical. People need information, guidance, and inspiration. Well, that's what you're doing for your districts. And we know as you look around your organization, your districts, there are a lot of heroes among your own staff members. Our mission has not changed. The basic fundamentals of leadership haven't changed, but it's harder to work remotely and with continued uncertainty. Hopefully we'll help you with some strategies today. And one of our focal points will be the interplay between academics and finance. Just as you do in your own district at Moat Casey, we have a connection between our accountability and staff and our finance staff. So our finance team will come in at different times today and help give us a high-level overview that helps put our accountability work into context. We're looking at Choose Your Own Adventure, how to be nimble in the spirit of being nimble, agile, and adaptable in this time. We want our presentation to meet your needs, and we'll flex to do that. So let's look at what might be your top concern right now. The COVID-19 slide and how we address it, what to consider in planning for next year, how the Texas Home Learning Network, what it can do for your district, and 2021 accountability after a gap year. How will schools and districts be evaluated? So we're going to give you a poll. Please select your top concern going into our next school year. All right, let's see how our poll results turned out. What are your top concerns? Monica, do you want to show our results?
They're coming. Yeah, sorry.
Here they come.
There we go. All right, I think you guys should see them now.
Okay, so top concerns, our winner is, what do we need to consider as we plan for next year? Okay, very good. Let's get started. And just a note that we're going to have this presentation. We'll make it available to you when we complete. And we'll also host office hours today that you can ask specific questions, and we'll post those times at the end of the presentation. So, Monica.
All right, thank you, Alicia, for kicking us off. And so we anticipated that many of you, the most pressing concern is with regards to planning. And so to frame our mindsets as we think about planning for next school year, we wanted to quickly talk about the COVID-19 slide. And so NWA MAP is a nationally normed student growth-based assessment that's administered across the nation, and they have actually put out some research based on the academic impacts from COVID closures for students. And so I'm going to go through some data really quickly. So with reading, preliminary COVID slide estimates suggest that students will return in fall of 2020 with roughly 70% of the learning gains in reading relative to a typical school year. So what NWA did in conducting this research is they basically looked at the period of time in which school closures happened and backtracked their data on summer learning loss. And so what we're seeing is that there are additional months, even if students were receiving virtual instruction. I think all of us on the call know that that is not a absolute substitute for the in-person learning that students would be receiving. And so we see very substantial gaps where students will be really returning with a lot of learning loss that teachers will be needing to be working very rigorously to make up for. And we see that these losses are particularly pronounced in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. So really thinking from an academic perspective of, how to really address these gaps. When we look at math, the loss is even more dramatic here. As anticipated, students are likely to show much smaller learning gains, returning with less than 50% of what we would typically see. And in some grade levels, like 3rd grade, you see it's anticipated that some students will return nearly a full year behind what we would observe in normal conditions. And so again, really thinking through the implications of this data. Of course, this is going to look different for different students, but NWA MAP conducts these assessments again across the nation, so they have a large sample size. And so we see that as we think about planning for school year 2020-2021, it's really important to acknowledge and address that students are going to be coming back substantially behind, and this is going to need to reflect in our planning, and we will talk through that here shortly. We also wanted to highlight what we see with regards to income levels of students. Again, even students from low income backgrounds are likely to be even more drastically impacted by this. We see this graph really demonstrates the achievement gap that we know exists. But even students from high income backgrounds are anticipated to come to school with, again, substantial learning loss. And so, again, this is really going to impact students in a number of different ways, not necessarily just academically, but also there is anticipated trauma from the experiences that students have been going through during COVID.
So brainstorm the following. As you think about your own academic planning to address the COVID slide, what do you and your team, your instructional team, need to do now? And what do you need to do in August of 2020? And then also consider what you need to do now in connection with your finance and budget team. And what do you need to do with them in August of 2020? And if you put your ideas as you brainstorm into the chat feature. We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Or maybe a minute. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on. Yes, noticing curriculum adjustments, right? Maybe modifying scope and sequences, thinking about what power standards we need to focus on by grade level, and targeting groups of kids, and new supply items, what we need to purchase given those issues. Other ideas that have come up in previous conversations include teacher training, how we deal with parents, working with parents, parent communications, of course, looking at calendars. There are a lot of different categories. Let's go on to summer.
All right, so as we discussed, there are going to be academic gaps that exist, and so districts across the state are looking at what they can do to make up that instructional time. And so for those of you who are interested in perhaps have already started summer school, we wanted to quickly go through the TEA guidance on summer school. It's hyperlinked here, so this presentation will be shared out in a PDF format along with the recording after for your reference. And so you'll be able to click on that summer school guidance list to take you to the TEA guidance for those of you looking to make up some instructional learning time during the summer. So of course, as we all know, STAR was canceled for school year 1920. And so that data that you would typically use to identify students for summer school, and particularly the SSI, does not exist. So that's something that I know you all are actively thinking about, of how to identify the highest need students to make sure that some of that instructional learning time is made up, and particularly for accelerating opportunities for students that are most in need. Again, this is guidance put out by TEA based on what Governor Abbott has stated. So starting June 1st, students can return to campuses under certain conditions. This is entirely optional based on district discretion, local context, and ability to implement the operational provisions. This particular summer school guidance document is lengthy, and it has a number of different operational considerations that must be enacted. And so, it is, again, an optional opportunity if districts feel like it's in the best interest of their students to do this. No more than 11 individuals can be in an enclosed area together, for example, as a class group. And students who are mandated to attend summer school as a condition of promotion or to otherwise obtain course credit must not be required to attend in person, but would still need to satisfy requirements virtually if they choose to not attend in person. One recent piece of guidance that Commissioner Morath discussed in his biweekly calls is the fact that that 120-hour requirement for bilingual and ESL students that typically takes place during the summer for rising kindergartners and first graders, he has actually extended that into next school year. So you have the entire academic school year 2020 to 2021 to meet that requirement for 120 hours. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and dive right into the topic that we know is most top of mind for many of you.
Thank you, Monica. One of the things that we thought about as we were putting this presentation together are some of the things that General McChrystal had spoken about when he gave a talk on April 14th about leading remote teams in a crisis environment. Probably most of you are kind of feeling like you might have felt if you were trying to put together a special operations team. General McChrystal said that crises require a careful balance of contingency planning and adaptability. He said that contingency planning is important because you have to think about all of the contingency plans of things that might happen. You can't plan for all of them, but you should at least plan for many of them. And you may only select one or two in the final run through of your special ops, but you're going to have to consider a lot of them. Secondly, once you have created all of these contingency plans, you need to be adaptable. Things are not always going to go as you plan them to. And so you may have to draw upon maybe some of the things that you had in a few of your other plans and pull them into the one that you're on at the moment. And you're just going to have to be flexible and nimble. I think those are going to be the two watchwords that we're looking at here. So as you're planning for school year 2021, The first thing are to think about wellness checks. I'm sure that all of you have been going through and trying to find students that you have not been able to reach this past spring. And you've probably done a pretty good job of finding them. But are there any remaining students that you still have not been able to find? Again, continue to try looking for those students. Secondly, you want to identify students for the Jump Start. If you had, since we had no STAR this past school year, how are you going to identify your highest need students? If you have not put them into any type of summer school, you might consider jump starting them for next year. How are you going to offer that instruction? Will it be in person? That'd be the best scenario, of course. Will it be virtual? Will you use a blended model? And then thirdly, you need to think about the assessments that you're going to use in the beginning of the year. You may want to use a TEA STAR Boy assessment that they have put up for this year. You may want to use your own assessments. You may want to use NWEA MAP, whatever you think is going to give you the most valuable information as you start your school year. Another few things that you may want to plan for is how are you going to address that COVID slide? You may, let me see, I'm getting around here on my notes. You may want to have individual plans for the COVID-19 slide. Even students that have never needed any extra attention may need a bit more consideration this year, whether it's in the area of academics or in the area of the socio-emotional. And then how will your PD needs be determined? Last year, everyone got a crash course in creating a virtual learning environment. This year, we have that opportunity to train everyone ahead of time for all of those contingencies. Like fire drills, we can train staff so they can be prepared. And then finally, how do we welcome students and families back to school? Consider what they're going to need to feel safe and welcomed, whether everyone gets back together physically, maybe just some are in the buildings, or if all are present in a virtual school environment. So there's three big different scenarios. The first one would be to open the school, maybe with some modifications. It's likely that there will be, even if we do open the schools physically, that there will be short-term disruptions. So we may see all three of these models actually occur next year at different times. So the first one, it could range from no modifications at all, which is highly unlikely, to things such as creating more space between student desks or even smaller class sizes. It may include just extra diligence in cleaning, modified extracurricular activities, or new drop-off and pickup procedures. In option B, if we have to close the schools completely, will we be ready this time to immediately reopen virtually? And then option C would be a hybrid or a blended model. Some students may need to stay at home and some may need to come to school physically. Which ones are going to do which? This may mean flowing seamlessly back and forth between a physical school and a virtual one as the situation dictates. As an example, Purdue University came out already with a very clear planning kit. Out of 700 colleges surveyed by the Chronicle of Higher Education, most have come to the same conclusion, and they will reopen with some in-person instruction in the fall. But with the example of Purdue, they've decided that each Boilermaker will receive a kit including face masks and a thermometer for daily temperature taking, as well as what they call the Protect Purdue Pledge, asking for a commitment to at least a semester of inconvenience, not primarily for the students' own protection, but for the safety of those who teach and otherwise serve them. They urge students to demonstrate their altruism by complying, but also challenging them to refute the cynics who say that today's young people are too selfish or self-indulgent to make this work. Now, of course, Purdue has this planning kit put into place, and so I urge you to think about what your planning kit might be for next year. That may be simple as putting together a new school supplies list and going over that. You may want to include masks that have your school logo or even some cleaning supplies. Many school supply lists already include boxes of tissues. You might want to add bottles of hand sanitizer or cleaning wipes to the list. Perhaps even a thermometer would be a good idea because not all homes have one that works. And this might be a way to make sure that you remind everyone to check their temperature. As we move on, let's go on to calendar considerations. That's an important part of next year's planning.
And in looking at calendars, it's likely that school year 2021 will likely, as Terry said, include some short-term disruptions. And we may see all three scenarios. So building a calendar that anticipates that will help minimize disruption, building in significantly more bad weather days to anticipate short-term closures. We've been looking at calendars from around the state, and there's a lot of variation right now. Some are beginning with Jumpstart in late July, early August around targeted students. Others are keeping their traditional calendar as voted on by their boards earlier in the spring. So what we do know is there is going to be certain uncertainty, right? So what do we need to have in place for this more complex and fluid environment? Additional time for special populations, those highest need students, additional bad weather makeup days, and then possibly adding additional minutes to each day that will end up building up to allow for more bad weather days by adding, say, 15 minutes to each day over time would provide an additional set of days. Adopting a year-round or intersessional calendar, we've had a lot of discussion about that from the commissioner's office. Looking at finishing the fall semester early, starting the spring semester late, and taking a longer winter holiday break. And then the House Bill 3 opportunity, additional days school year incentive funding for extended year. Here to tell us a little bit more, expand about the ADSY funding is our finance team.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Alicia. I'm Catherine Knapp. I'm with the finance team, and it's so nice to have friends in the office that we can collaborate with. As you know, working in schools, you've got to communicate with each other about how finance impacts instruction and how instruction may have an impact on budgets. So yes, a part of the additional days school year incentive funding here is this reconsideration of the calendar, right? So many of you are thinking about with your administration how to create intersessional periods or other adjustments to your calendar to help combat the COVID-19 slide that my colleagues have talked to you about this morning. Now, TEA is providing some half-day formula funding for up to 30 additional instructional days. But those instructional days have to begin September 1st in order to be eligible for that funding. So for those of you who are considering or implementing that July Jumpstart, know that those days in July would not be eligible for that additional funding. It has to be a little bit later in the year. Now, only elementary schools are eligible for this funding. So if you're planning to bring back your middle and high school students, that may be instructionally appropriate. Certainly it is for those who have great learning losses, but the funding will only apply to those half-day kiddos in PK to 5. Now remember that you have to meet your 180-day requirement and the 75,600 minute requirement in order to be eligible for this. So I know many of you that are in districts of innovation or have different kinds of school calendars already may be jumping at this opportunity, but you may have to add more than 30 days if you're looking at a smaller calendar because of what you've been doing in the last couple of years.
And Catherine, if I can just jump in here real quickly and mention one thing. I know that something that has come up on the commissioner call with regards to the additional days is whether there's going to be any flexibility to the testing calendar for next school year. And they have already announced that any paper-based STAR exams, there is not going to be any flexibility to that testing window. And it would only be for online testing opportunities that they're looking to expand that testing window. But again, without being able to front load these days from a funding perspective, I did want to just highlight that. That many of these additional days would probably be structured after the testing window.
Yeah, no, that's definitely important. So trying to figure that out. I know we've had some school districts be considering Saturday training for students as well. So districts adopting these additional days in their calendar. What's interesting about House Bill 3 is this is one of the few things in the second biennium that's being implemented for the first time. And as a result, the calendar is going to look a little different in terms of how your cash works and when those, how the attendance is taken this first year. So you'll see that under normal circumstances, you'd have your 180 days, and then you'd have the 7th 6 weeks attendance would be taken and reported on in August. Then that will help you account for those additional 30 days. And then but you may end up having scheduled days you wouldn't normally have had during that 180-day period. So some of your quote normal days may be pushed further into the summer, but the total there, the excess goes then through June and July or end of May. And then the settle up process, you'll see far in advance later on, TA funds flow funds to districts in April of May of 2022 during the final settle up for the 2021 school year. So as you work with your finance departments to be considering how this is all going to work, that may be something that they have in the back of their mind is when they're actually going to see this cash. And as you know, the budget standpoint for the state and then therefore your district will probably look a little different than we were hoping in the next year. So that additional funding may be particularly helpful, but the timing may not be right on the money for what you guys need. Yeah, so you've got this per student additional funding for 30 additional days at about $25 per half day. And then here's just a little bit of how that would multiply out to equal out to your school funding level, and just some of the different applicable expenses that you could have. So they've got this $10,680 as a rough classroom level funding amount. Could be used to pay for teacher pay increases. And then also at the school funding level, if you look at it at that level, you've got teacher salaries, coming out of that about, half of that or so. And then school operations in terms of transportation, food, administration, just as it's not just about getting the kids into the classroom and instructions only, but also making sure that the lights are on and that you've got your custodial staff cleaning up and all the things that you need that maybe we've forgotten about since we've been operating remotely.
Good morning, this is Joe Wisnowski. I'm going to talk a little bit about state budget issues. You'll all probably be aware that Governor Abbott and the other state leadership positions have asked state agencies to plan for 5% cuts in their budgets for the current biennium. That actually equates to more like an 8% cut in budgets from this point forward, because we're already 3/4 of the way through the first fiscal year of the biennium. Roughly 75% of the state budgets are not subject to this cut. That includes the Foundation School Program and teacher retirement system contributions, along with a variety of other state agencies like State Health Services, the Department of Public Safety, corrections, community colleges, Medicaid, and so forth. So there are lots of things that are exempt. That equates to about a $1.5 billion reduction in these non-exempt services for the remainder of this particular biennium. In terms of, if we move on to the next slide, the message from TEA and state leadership so far has been very consistent that there are no cuts to school funding being discussed for the 2021 school year. However, we're still fairly early in this COVID-19 crisis, and the impact on the economy may influence what they do come January when the next legislature meets. Move on, we've been looking at state resources. The sales tax is the largest tax for the state, makes up almost 50% of the general fund monies that the state receives. The past 2 months have not been particularly good in sales tax receipts. You'll see that in May, the sales tax was 13% below what it was for the preceding year. It's been forecast to be significantly higher than the preceding year, so that's a big drop from what was projected for May. May receipts reflect April economic activity. Sales tax collections lag behind by a month. So what you're seeing there is actually the impact in April when the economy was largely shelter in place. Much of it was closed down. In May, we've begun to open up a few things. So in June, when we see the sales tax receipts for June, it will reflect May, and we'll get a better sense of any lingering impact on sales taxes. Now, aside from sales taxes, there are other significant taxes in the state budget. You can see here that, that virtually everything except cigarette and tobacco taxes are performing worse than was anticipated. Right now, so far, we think we're running about $1.8 billion behind for the months that have occurred so far in the state fiscal biennium. So we don't know exactly how deep this will be, but in the next few weeks, we should learn a little bit more about not only how this fares, but also what the state's expectations are for next biennium. If we move on to I think the next slide, we're actually into the CARES Act. Let me just wrap up the state budget section by saying that in early July, we will be getting the tax revenue information for June, which reflects May activity. And by mid-July, we expect the controller to have a new revenue forecast for the biennium. The period of August through the fall is going to involve state agency budget requests and the beginning of hearings on those budget requests. We still don't have instructions to state agencies regarding state budgets, but we will see that soon because the requests start becoming due in August. It's a picture that's evolving, and we should see more information about it in the next few months that might help guide some of the decisions that you need to be thinking of longer term about the kinds of services that you can afford to pay for with the foundation school program funding. Now let's go to the federal funding portion. I think this was supposed to be Josh, but it sounds like Josh.
I can, yeah, I thought Catherine, yeah.
Oh, sure, yeah, go ahead. I'll take it from here, sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
So on the CARES Act funding, there are several different federal stimulus packages that we've seen come through. The biggest one that we've all been thinking about and heard about is the CARES Act, and that's the third of the 4 stimulus packages passed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's $2 trillion package that includes 3 main education-related grant programs. So it's hard to keep track of where all the money is coming from, and a lot of that has to do with, and that impacts the way that you can use these funds. So it's important to keep track of that funding flow. So here we've got $3 billion to the governor's emergency education relief fund. And then the second is the ESSER fund, which we have probably heard more about recently. And that's $1 billion and about $1.3 billion for Texas. And then this last one is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. And those are all kind of grouped together in that $2 trillion package. But then there's this separate coronavirus relief fund that I think could be easily confused with the ESSER funding if we're not thinking carefully about it. And those two have slightly different applications and funding patterns. and the coronavirus. Okay, so in terms of how your finance staff may be thinking through how to use these funds, because they do have different expectations and requirements as well as allowable costs, they may be considering how to apply funding according to how restrictive those things are. So we've put this little chart here together for you so you can understand that where FEMA is most restrictive. So certain expenses like cleaning and sanitization expenses may be applied with FEMA funding first. And then this coronavirus relief fund, which acts more as a reimbursement rather than a federal cost share type expenditure like FEMA, can be used for remote learning costs, but much more specific in terms of how you can spend it than say the ESSER fund, but much more expansive than the FEMA one. And here you have about $300 million statewide. And this is based upon the number of comp-ed students you have or a floor of about $50,000 per district if you don't have as many comp-ed students as some of the larger districts. And then the ESSER fund, which is also part of the CARES Act, the state is using the money to pay for its share of the school finance system. So this is not new money. So where the FEMA and coronavirus relief fund may be money on top of what your finance department was expecting, the ESSER funding is really going to replace some of the funding they were expecting to receive from the state anyway. And the good news is this is broadly, there's broad eligible costs for this. So they may be actually taking regular staff salaries and applying this funding to it, but it's subject to lots of requirements in terms of reporting. So they may be having to be a little bit more creative about how they apply these funds. And it's subject to equitable service provisions, which basically means that they have to allow for private and nonprofit, not-for-profit organizations, private schools, et cetera, to participate in some of this federal share. So what do we know right now about this governor's emergency education relief fund, which is separate from some of those funds that we just talked about? Texas will be allocated about $307 million. Governor Abbott has considerable discretion over how this is spent, similar to the discretion he has over the money that's the coronavirus relief fund, which is different. But the staff hasn't released any details about that yet. And the U.S. Education Secretary has said that governors should focus on costs related to remote learning, and the equitable service requirements also apply to this, but it's probably not worth counting on this money heading to K-12 schools right now, even though that pot may be available, because it could be used for any number of purposes, including higher education. So then in terms of potential monies that could come later on, negotiations are heating up between parties in Congress over a fifth stimulus package. Democrats have passed a $3 trillion HEROES Act out of the House. That includes a $90 billion state fiscal stabilization fund. It could also include additional money to support increased internet connectivity. So I know many of you in certain rural areas especially may not have the kind of internet access that you need to stand up virtual instruction. So that's the thing I'm keeping my eye on a lot in this, in addition to potential additional funding. And Republicans have become increasingly open to this additional package, though not on the same scale. So be cautious, don't spend money you don't have, but know that some funding may be available, which would be supportive of additional costs as you see them throughout the year.
So lots of additional funding, all with different parameters. And we appreciate the work of the financial and budget teams that are really will help put the wheels under the instructional planning that's going to be needed to move our young people forward this year. Let's think about your top concerns when planning for these instructional components, right? How are we proactive in each of these areas around a brick and mortar scenario, a virtual, or a hybrid? How will you connect scope and sequence to each format, address social and emotional learning under each format, and how to ensure that focus on kids with special needs, our special populations, are met in each format? We've got another poll for you. Choose your top concern. And I think our polls should be coming up.
One moment.
We put the polls in because we really want to hear your
Oh,
voice.
I'm sorry. That is the other one. One moment, please.
No worries.
There we go.
All right. How do we connect scope and sequence, address social and emotional learning, and ensure the needs of special populations are met? Would you please pick your top priority starting now? Okay, we'll give you a couple more seconds if you haven't made your selection. All right, let's stop the poll and see what our results are. Top concerns. Yes, how do we meet the needs of our special populations? There's interest at every level, but certainly thinking about kids who are our most struggling students, top need. Thank you very much. Monica, would you share with us, starting with one of those features, the Home Learning Network?
Sure, yes. And so we want to quickly acknowledge that we are running up to the end of our scheduled time, but we want to make sure to continue to go through the content we have prepared for you all. But for those of you that do need to hop off, we will be sharing out the slides as well as the recording of the presentation, but we're going to go ahead and keep going through this. Additionally, I did want to make a quick plug. We will be hosting office hours throughout the day. And so I will have my email address up at the end of this presentation for those of you who have not yet registered but are interested in learning more about these topics. But as we think about instructional adaptability, one of the key components is going to be thinking through scope and sequence and how to use the lessons learned from the end of last school year. Now that we're, not having to stand up a fully virtual system essentially overnight, it gives us some time to reflect on what went well, what didn't go well, and how can we ensure more seamless transitions as we anticipate that there may be times in the next school year where we will need to switch between face-to-face delivery and to virtual. So when we think specifically about scope and sequence, the TEA, we do want to shout out the Texas Home Learning Network. That is an exceptional resource that they have gone ahead and stood up. That includes both virtual and paper resources with lesson plans and schedules and a whole host of resources and guidance that corresponds to the Texas Home Learning Network. And so we really encourage districts to take a look at that and think through how they can leverage those resources and how could it potentially be adapted to face-to-face content delivery. Use of existing district curriculum. How can traditional face-to-face content be adapted to engaging online delivery so that districts can switch between face-to-face to online as needed? And especially when we think about scheduling and perhaps only having students in person 2 times a week to allow for smaller class sizes. Really thinking through what it will look like to transition your existing district curriculum into a virtual format. And then finally, how could both of the above delivery systems be integrated to provide seamless instruction regardless of format? So when we think about these things, there are many considerations for teaching and learning. Of course, teacher and staff development. Teacher and staff training will need to be embedded throughout the year. And again, it may be possible that some of these trainings will need to be conducted in a remote fashion. We'll also want to make sure that our staff will be prepared for various instructional models. If they do have to go to a virtual format, how do we ensure that all of our teachers feel comfortable and familiar to instruct in that model? When we think about staffing, part of the reason we wanted to have our finance staff join us today is just to share kind of the current economic environment and help us think through the alignment between what we need on the academic side and also just have a clear picture of what to expect from your financial office. And so when we think about staffing, there may be additional needs that you anticipate. We anticipate that kids will come back not just with academic gaps, but also with various socio-emotional needs and perhaps some trauma. So perhaps more counselors and social workers and interventionists may need to be hired. And I've heard of districts thinking strategically about employing, retired teachers to come back and volunteer. And so really thinking through that. Evaluating scope and sequence. We know that there will be learning loss and we'll need to do some diagnostics at the beginning of the year that may require redesigning the scope and sequence to account for learning loss. The beginning of year assessment, we'll talk a little bit more about TEA's option for this, but it will be really critical to evaluate where students are starting the school year at. And not just collecting the data, but what are you going to do with that data? How are you going to use that to really strategically align your scope and sequence, train up your teachers, and make sure that those power standards are addressed. Interventions and supports will need to be implemented immediately to address learning gaps. Terry highlighted some districts that are going to implement a Jumpstart program and just really thinking through what that will look like. And of course, special populations, that's top of mind for many of you on this call. How will delivery mode affect special populations? And so really, we encourage you all to take the summer to reflect on what lessons were learned from the end of the school year. And so how can problems be anticipated and addressed for next school year?
Yeah, so TEA has put together a STAR Boy assessment that will be optional for this next year. But the first thing, as we're planning and thinking about this, is we need to think about why we're using the assessment. Is this something that we need to do, or is it something that we can achieve by using some other assessment? Now, if you choose to use the TEA Boy assessment, think about the logistics that are involved. It's unlike the interim assessments, it's going to be a full-blown STAR test, and so you'll need to consider all of the same things that you normally consider when you're administering STAR. So I urge you to think about the who, the when, and the why on this assessment. Who are you going to test? When are you going to test them? And finally, why are you testing them? What information do you hope to get out of it? For example, for high school students moving to the next course in their sequence, you may find more value in administering the Boy assessment for the course they just completed. So if you have geometry students currently this year, they took algebra last year, it may be important to go ahead and have them take the algebra test to know exactly what their learning loss is, and also to inform your instruction for the coming year's algebra students. Also, anybody who did not successfully complete a test last year, you may want to assess them. If someone failed Algebra 1, for example, and is taking it again this year, you're going to want to give them the algebra test.
And one quick other note to make is because, as Terry mentioned, these are full-length STAR tests, you will, when building your calendar for next year, think through, again, the who and the what behind this, but also making sure that you really schedule them strategically. And we did include the testing windows here, so you can keep those in mind as you think through what the beginning of next school year looks like.
Exactly, that's the when. And then as you look at that assessment and any other assessment you have, you're going to have to start looking at your item analysis. I just gave you a quick example here that came from one district, nothing that you guys need to copy or anything, but just to let you know that there's a lot of software packages that will do this for you. For any test that you might have, not just the STAR test, but also for other tests. And you might also get down to the classroom. This is a good time to do some professional development with your teachers about how to use this in order to inform their instruction. If you see that even the high performing kids are not doing well on a particular TEK, it may be something you have to spiral back in. If everybody except for the students who did not perform well overall on a test have seemed to get a particular TEK, then maybe it's something where you're going to have to do some small group planning.
All right, thank you, Terry. Next, we wanted to talk about the importance of addressing socio-emotional needs in addition to those academic needs that we just discussed. So what we do know is that students are likely going to return to school with trauma and interrupted academic growth. Families may be less secure financially, and students will likely have experienced significant disruptions in social isolation. Support structures may be limited and modified, and it's important to note that your staff may be returning having experienced some level of these same challenges. So when we think about next school year, we want to make sure that we are addressing not just the academic needs, but also the socio-emotional needs of our students. And so it will be really important to reestablish a sense of belonging in school community so that parents and students feel safe and comfortable coming back to school. Addressing the whole child, making sure to prioritize not just Bloom's, but also Maslow's needs. We've been thinking through, how teachers can assess what students have experienced during the COVID closures. May be necessary to do some trauma screenings and that type of thing. Explicitly teaching growth mindset, empathy, resilience, and social skills through curriculum integration when we think about literary choices and history and social studies instruction. A focus on inclusive instruction and really making sure to differentiate. We've even thought through perhaps the need to write IEPs for every student and have all of our students, regardless of whether they're designated for special education services, really thinking strategically about the differentiated needs of our learners and aligning resources accordingly. Tapping into student voice through surveys and focus groups, exploring alternative disciplinary systems, and of course there will be a need to modify student extracurriculars to replicate the connection and support that students get from that. And so that wraps up our section in terms of planning for next school year. We did have two more topics that I wanted to quickly go through before we wrap up today. And first is the Texas Home Learning Network. Again, we wanted to highlight this resource that TEA has stood up. It's completely optional, but it does give parents and families the opportunity to work with their students on instruction this summer. There are lesson plans shortened to 4 weeks that are organized by subject. And so again, at minimum, we think that this is a really helpful tool to at least share with your parents and families that are interested in engaging with their students for summer learning resources. And I'm going to turn it over to Terry to close us with an accountability update.
Thanks, Monica. Of course, I like this particular quote that all state standardized testing was canceled and it only took a pandemic to make it happen. But given that, we don't have accountability for 2020. We do have some accountability. In fact, I can already give you your ratings for this year. For all campuses and districts, you'll be rated, not rated, declared state of disaster. One thing to note about this is that that particular rating designation is not going to break any chains of consecutive years of unacceptable ratings. Think of the 2021 school year as a continuation of the 1920 school year in terms of accountability. So whatever sanctions you were doing in 1920, you will continue to do the same ones. For those of you in Hurricane Harvey, you know how this chain did not break. It will be the same. There are some of you who thought that you probably would be given some type of acceptable rating, and unfortunately, this will not get you out of those campus sanctions and interventions because there is no other way to demonstrate in 1920 that you would have been acceptable. The CCMR data, they're going to use that only for reporting purposes in TAPER, and it's obviously not going to be used in any 1920 ratings. And then finally, the use of any lagging data that might be affected by the test cancellations during 1920 is yet to be determined. So now how are we going to do 2021 accountability? The only thing we do know for a fact is that TEA is going to rely on the recommendations from their two committees that they use for accountability guidance, the ATAC and the APAC committees.
And we think in generalities, but we know we live in detail. Let's go to the next screen, because if there are details that you have special questions about or you'd like more information about, we do have these office hours today, looking at using the home learning network. Starting at 10:15, we'll have a 30-minute session. And then the COVID slide and how that might impact your decisions about your calendar. Discussion about that from 11 to 11:30. And finally, at the end of the day today, more information, more time to talk about accountability implications after this, what we're calling an accountability gap year. If you haven't already signed up, and we know a number of you have, but if you haven't and you want to, just email Monica Zdroyewski at motecasey.com to join. And it's been a pleasure being with you this morning. And look forward to seeing you during the chat session, or shoot us an email for any additional information you might want, and we will be sending out this presentation. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day.